I wanted to start this video off in a very explosive way by saying what I actually think Deltarune is about, but then I realized there's words and phrases you're not allowed to say within the first 15 seconds of a YouTube video because then it will get demonetized and everything, so, we gotta wait a little bit, and, let me, look at my watch here. Okay, we're good. Deltarune is about child abuse. Now, you might immediately say, whoa, Big Citrus, surely that's not true. Also, that nose piercing makes you look a little fruity. I know. And yeah, you're also saying that, well, Deltarune is ultimately about the theme of your choices not mattering. Look at everything Kris does throughout the game, trying to stop the soul and or the player, and look at everything with the prophecy, your choices don't matter. But what if I told you the themes of child abuse and your choices don't matter are the same theme? Everyone's been making theories about the real ending of the prophecy and what it means and who the Roaring Knight actually is, and those are all great, but I kind of want to make a video on something that I could more or less actually prove. Some people are going to argue that Toby Fox would not intentionally make that such a focal point of the game given how it might turn off players, but given how many little intentional details are left in that directly point to CA, to the point where every time I think about Deltarune, every time I think about a theory, every time I think about anything to do with the game, it always comes back to my mind. Also, from here on out, I'm simply going to refer to what I just said as CA instead of saying the full term because, I'll get fucked. I replied to a Deltarune account on Twitter saying this, and, at the time, even when I said that, I wasn't like 100% sure of it until I got a reply from this person saying, one of the themes, 100% yes, but not entirely. I don't know, it seems to permeate through every single main character arc in the game. And then I thought about it, and I was like, wait, he's right. Also, if you're a beautiful, handsome being, and you have factually correct opinions about everything, go ahead and follow my Twitter. I'm sure we'll be friends. I'll be including timestamps that I'll make sure are specific to kind of let you know what forms of CA I'm mostly talking about, so if you want to skip that, you can kind of make your decisions from there, because your choices do matter. Hello, everybody. I'm Big Citrus, and let's get into it. So yeah, I'm gonna go through every single character and completely break down, and of course, prove my very right theory. And I think the character that is the easiest to explain and prove my point is Berdly. I'm serious. I got this video made by Stuffed Alpaca in my recommended recently. That was about a question I had leading up to the release of chapters 3 and 4, and that's, why is Berdly in Deltarune? Now, I know there are some people who think Berdly is the spawn of Satan, and don't even care if he's a possible victim of CA, but I absolutely think understanding Berdly is crucial to understanding what Toby Fox is ultimately trying to make Deltarune about. Which, for the record, I believe that Deltarune is meant to explore just childhood in general, the kind of dreamlike wonder of it all, and the repressed trauma that you push down, and how people cope with that differently. Now, in Hometown, we see all of our other classmates that we could possibly go on Dark World adventures on. However, so far up to this point, it has just been Berdly and Noelle, and it has just been in chapter 2. And I think there's a very specific purpose behind this. A lot of people have theories that each chapter is going to try and break the formula of the previous chapter, and if you kind of look at the structure of each chapter that we've had, that completely tracks so far. And I think Berdly is mainly in chapter 2, obviously just because he's goated and he's funny. Berdly is there mostly to help flesh out Noelle's character, but that doesn't mean Berdly doesn't have a lot of his own going on, but you really kind of have to dig for it, and chapters 3 and 4 ultimately prove that Berdly is in Deltarune to kind of reinforce this theme of your choices don't matter and the themes of CA. And this section is going to be called, what's worse, having a parrot who's around too much or having a parrot that's not around at all? And we're going to be talking about Berdly, Queen, and Noelle in this section. Starting with Berdly, where the fuck are his parents? While we don't meet all of our classmates' parents, we meet most of them. And Berdly, who up to this point in the game is in like the top 6 characters we've interacted with the most, a character who is recognized by Gaster, intentionally has not had any family around. After the events of Snowgrave, he gets put in the fucking hospital, and still, no one comes to see him. Which, let me remind you, the events of Snowgrave are caused by us, the player. We are the ones making Kris and Noelle do this to Berdly, and Berdly has no knowledge or autonomy of the situation. So if anything, we, the player, are committing CA, which I will touch more upon later. You would think if your child was on their goddamn deathbed in a coma, you would drop everything to go see them, and you would not leave their side at all. Even if the doctors told you they weren't going to wake up anytime soon, you would be in a manic state, not wanting to leave in case something happened, the worst happened. At the end of chapter 2, he also rushes straight away to go work for his second job with Miss Boom, which he works at the library, and then he also does work with her. Kind of shows to me he has a lot of free time on his hands, not spending time with family apparently. And Miss Boom doesn't even remember his name. Yes, I know, she's old, but that's sad, even more sad when you take into account the relationship that Berdly has with Queen in chapter 2. Now, while Queen isn't really a villain in, I feel like the way she treats Berdly is kind of the worst thing she does in all of chapter 2. At first, she kind of asks Berdly to help her out with stuff, giving him the attention and validation that, as we find out from the whole spelling bee fiasco and the whole thing about him wanting to be smart, is the thing that he desires more than anything else, is just being noticed, being seen. And as the chapter goes on and Berdly, you know, continues to be himself, Queen starts to reject and push him away more, ultimately favoring Noelle. I think some of the objects that come from the light world into the dark world are kind of a manifestation of the psychology and the mind of the person who created that dark fountain. By the way, I think the person who created the dark fountain in chapter 2 was Noelle. She was in the computer lab, she was already in the dark world with Berdly before we got there. It makes sense. And since Berdly is also a lightener and there when she created it, I like to think that Queen in a way is kind of a manifestation of Berdly's lack of parents and Noelle's not lack of parent. Another form of CA is when a parent chooses to be more attached to a child that isn't theirs because ultimately they favor that child more than their own, and that completely destroys the child that they actually have inside. I kind of think this is something that is going on also with Carol and Kris. I'll talk about that later. Berdly continues to seek Queen's affection throughout the chapter, and it is mostly played for laughs, but there has to be a reason that he wants her to notice him so bad, right? He wants to believe she's a gamer, that they have similar interests, and that she actually values him, and ultimately none of that's true. It's very common with people who are starved for attention and who don't get enough attention at home. I'm going to be speaking from personal experience a lot in this video, to act out at school, in public, and kind of do whatever they think people want them to do in order to get the attention and eyes on them that they don't get at home. I honestly think that everything that Toby Fox does is intentional. Look with how he changed one singular animation in the chapter 4 weird route with the deflowering imagery, with everything that goes on with Noelle. There's so many little details and things in Undertale and Deltarune that are completely left in or left out that are intentional, so much to the point where I have to believe that Berdly goes through a lot of psychological trauma because his parents are never around. And given everything that's happened in the game so far, it would really appear that they don't really love him either. And that explains exactly why he acts the way that he does, and has this weird delusion about Noelle having a crush on him, even though that's definitely not true. In his head, he has this kind of detachment for people not loving him. He just wants to believe that they do.
Oh, sweet rotisserie Santa, the nightmare is become real. Susie hurting Noelle just to stop me from going with her. She's gone yandere for me. Go ahead and taunt Kris. I'm the one Noelle and Susie are falling like dominoes for. And you know what dominoes means, Kris? You're next.
Queen is obviously supposed to kind of represent Noelle's mother with how she kind of helicopter parents her and is always seeking her out even just when Noelle wants to be alone. It makes a lot of sense given whatever happened to Des made them disappear and they're not around anymore. It would make sense that after those events that Carol is completely just up Noelle's ass all the time, never really letting her do anything she wants to do, and is concerned for her safety and never letting her be herself, forcing Noelle to make choices that Carol wants her to make. I feel like there's a lot more that kind of went on with Noelle and Carol's relationship that we have not gotten to see yet. When Noelle finds out from Asgore in chapter 4 that Carol is home, Noelle legitimately freaks the fuck out. And yeah, you could say that's because Susie is there and she has the guitar and everything and she knows how she's gonna react, but I'd like to think that Noelle would have been just about as freaked out even if Susie was just there. In both instances with Berdly and Noelle, and especially the relationship with Queen and their actual real parents, their choices don't matter. Noelle cannot stop Carol from constantly putting this pressure on her, and Berdly cannot make his parents love him. Now, I don't want to exactly make predictions about someone's life, but I do not think Rudy is gonna make it all the way to chapter 7. Chapter 4 with Gerson, we were introduced to the concept of people from the light world possibly being revived in the dark world. I would not be surprised at all if Rudy ends up going to the big JCPenney Christmas layaway sale in the sky. And Susie, knowing kind of how this worked with Gerson, tries to convince Noelle that there's a way that they can bring Rudy back in the dark world, and that's how Noelle will end up back there. And as we've seen with Snowdrake's parent, Toby Fox is not afraid to introduce the concept of a grieving child actively struggling with the death of their parent into this game. I wonder if they told any jokes at her funeral. Mother, I don't even know her. Okay, for real though, from here the video is going to become much more serious because the topics we're going to be discussing are just not as easy to joke about. I'll try to keep it lighthearted, but I also do really want to emphasize the weight of a lot of these situations. sense. Before we get into the really heavy stuff with the characters who I know you're waiting for me to talk about, I kind of want to talk about what I think the concept of the light world and the dark world means to the themes of your choices don't matter and CA in this game. When you're a child, you kind of hope that there's going to be that magical runaway place that you can go to that will make you forget about all your problems, where you can pretend to be someone else for a bit and not have to face any of the things that bother you in your actual life. We can see that this is such a big appeal for Susie, and despite all of the weird fucked up shit going on, she genuinely enjoys going on this adventure with you, Ralse, and everybody else. Kris also does genuinely seem to enjoy exploring the dark world with Susie, and is very adamant to do so. I feel like Kris, knowing what they know about everything with the Roaring Night and the prophecy from working with Carol, should probably have been a little more adverse to Susie just making a dark fountain in chapter 4, but when she brings up the idea, Kris is just like, yeah, fuck it, bro, here's my knife. Let's go rip this shit, bro. This is also another reason why I believe Noelle made the chapter 2 dark fountain. It's obviously very internet and cyber themed, and also it was low-key confirmed in the Spamton sweepstakes thing that she created Spamton. I'm not saying she necessarily did it on purpose, but I think somehow in there with Berdly, she accidentally created the chapter 2 dark fountain. Maybe she was probably daydreaming about Des and how much she missed her, and wishing that she could feel closer to her again. It's obviously brought up a lot, especially in the newer chapters, about how the dark fountains and the dark worlds are basically just dreams. We see how in the chapter 4 dark fountain that Susie creates, it's a lot more destructive than the one that is presumably made by the Night. It does seem like the Roaring Night is making the dark fountains tailored to Kris specifically. I know that there's an organ in the church and everything, but it really does seem tailored to Kris with the amount of opportunities Kris is given to play the piano and use music as a way to traverse and progress through the chapter. Whereas when Susie creates the dark fountain, yeah, the piano is there and everything, but now you're using it to drive it around like a fucking semi-truck, destroying everything in your path. The color palette is a bit more muted and gray like Susie's is in the light world, and it just makes a lot of sense to me. With the amount of power that hopes and dreams are given in Undertale and the amount of time Toby Fox brings that up throughout those games, I think that Deltarune is ultimately meant to explore how sometimes when you're a kid, running away and dreaming can be fun, and the best thing you can do to try and distract yourself from the situation that you find yourself in that you so desperately wish you weren't. While there's a lot of pretty obvious stuff in this game with how it connects itself to CA and or references it, I do love how subtle the concept of the dark fountains and the dark worlds in reference to CA. But I also really love the subtlety with a character like Catti. Catti says too much weird shit for them to not have at least some sort of small role in the following chapters. So I'm sure we'll get to learn more about them, and I'm sure we'll get to see other characters react to the way they view their relationship with their parents. But I think Catti is a great example of people who don't realize they have good parents and act like they don't. Catti's parents, while a little cringe and are a bit overbearing, genuinely love her and just want to support her as much as they can in anything that she's doing. Catti is, of course, embarrassed by her parents and honestly kind of seems to genuinely hate them. And I think we all grew up knowing that one person who just absolutely despised their parents supporting them as much as they did and kind of wished we could have that. I hope that Catti kind of gets a reality check in later chapters, because out of all the other kids who have experienced some form of CA in this town, Catti is the one person who I'm gonna go out on a limb and says hasn't, but ultimately hates their parents the most out of everyone, it seems. As promised, it's now time to get into the more serious stuff, and it's now time to talk about Susie Deltarune. I think there's a big reason why Susie is my favorite character in the game, and that is because she is probably the most accurate depiction of a teenager suppressing abusive trauma. First things first, I want to say, I think Susie is the main character of Deltarune. Obviously not in the sense of the character that we play as, but I think by the time the game is done, and when you look at the general narrative, Susie is the closest thing that we're going to have to a protagonist. I kind of mentioned this in my last Deltarune video, and I feel like Kris is almost meant to be, at least from someone like Susie's perspective, our weird friend that we don't really understand completely, but is along for the ride all the way throughout the journey. For some reason, is the one person that we feel like we trust. Because we control Kris in this game, we have a very different perspective on how this story plays out. I saw a theory that said Susie was just kind of a pawn this entire scheme with the prophecy and everything going on with the Night, and that a lot of the other characters in Hometown, including Alphys and Undyne, among others, are kind of in on what Carol Holiday is planning with everything, trying to bring her daughter Des back, and that Susie was needed to be a sacrifice. I do not believe this theory, and honestly, I don't think characters like Alphys and Undyne are gonna have like a huge significance to the plot of this game, but I did like one part of the theory they pointed out, that the reason Susie was selected as the target is because no one would miss her. She's the girl at school that nobody likes and everybody's scared of and really wouldn't care care if the next day they never saw her again. I really do like thinking about the fact that the dark world is really all that Susie has, or at least that's what she thinks. In the later chapters, she really loves talking about how much she enjoys going on adventures with you, Ralsei, Lancer, everybody else, and how no matter what happens, she wants to continue hanging out with you guys because it's really the only place where she feels like she could be herself, the only place that feels like home to her. But as we've seen throughout the later chapters, Susie has actually started to make waves in hometown. She develops a good relationship with Toriel, Noelle, and even to a small extent Berdly. And it's kind of just weird thinking about how so far technically the game has taken place over the course of 4 days, but you know, when you do some quick math, that like quadruples the amount of friends she had on day 1 of this game, so you know, she's making good progress. But the escapism the dark worlds offer is pure bliss for Susie, because in the light world, even though things have been going better for her, I still think it doesn't change the fact that Susie does not have a home of her own. Now, there are 2 ways to take that, metaphorically and literally. Starting with the latter, does Susie live somewhere? Every time that we're not walking around in hometown with her, we can never find where she lives. She never even remotely talks about it, and the only references that we get to anything about her home life make it seem like Susie lives somewhere where there's no food, which would make sense with her eating the chalk in chapter 1 and everything, and the fact that she'll literally just eat anything when it is offered to her and doesn't really understand what real food even is, because, you know, she's starving. The scene where Ralsei shows Kris and Susie their room that he made for them in chapter 2 is also incredibly telling. Kris's room is definitely designed very similar to the room they have in real life, but specifically it is just their own room, free of the constant reminder of Azrael and how much everyone loves him so much. And then Susie's room is basically just catered to her personality, or what Ralsei thought that was at the time. And from the dialogue in this, it definitely supports the whole Susie is homeless theory, or Susie comes from a long string of incredibly broken foster homes. Also in chapter 2, when Queen pulls like her internet search history, all of her internet searches are just at the library instead of her own actual house. It would kind of make a lot of sense that she maybe does not have a roof to sleep under. On the contrary though, these 2 pieces of dialogue that are incredibly easy to miss or not put together kind of confirm that this is where Susie lives in hometown.
Hey, I thought we were going to your house. Can we just go to your house?
Specifically, Susie says, "Can we go to your house?" And contextually, in the English language, the way she says that implies that Susie would prefer to go to Kris's house instead of her house. That's just how that makes sense. One thing I had never really thought about too hard was the existence of the scar on Susie's face and all of her sprites. For basically all of chapter 1, Susie has her eyes covered by her hair like Kris does. Only until she starts to feel more comfortable around us and just comfortable in general does she stop having it over her face all the time and we can see the visible scar across her eye. There's a lot of ways she could have gotten this scar. Given the distrust she has for people who she thinks don't like her, like she won't go into the diner when Catti's there because she hates her, and she won't really talk to any of the other kids like Monster Kid and Snowdrake because she knows for a fact they don't like her. It really is common with people who experience physical CA as a child where they just don't trust anyone who they're not super comfortable around because they're afraid that they might get angry and hurt them. It was really nice in chapters 2 and 3 to start to think that Susie would have a new place to call home, living at Kris's house with them and Toriel. Toriel is incredibly sweet and kind to Susie, and Susie seems to really open up around Toriel in a way that she still isn't opening up around other people in hometown with. Her demeanor and speech really changes. It really seems like Toriel is an adult that she genuinely trusts and cares about. The flashback with the hot chocolate thing also confirms that Toriel is the only adult, at least in hometown, that ever showed Susie any kindness. It also kind of seems like Toriel specifically wants Susie around for Kris. Something about chapter 1. What? Wait, you probably just heard my brain broke when I was trying to say that. I'm gonna keep that in the video. It's gonna sound weird as fuck, but let me explain. So, at the end of chapter 1, Toriel says this.
Kris, whatever have you been doing? I sat in the car waiting for you after school for half an hour. I called and called, but you never picked up. You had your poor mother worried sick. Kris, I am afraid I'm going to have to punish you. Huh? A friend? You were spending time with a friend? Kris, I will make an exception this time. You can continue your adventures a little longer.
Now, this makes you think that Kris literally has never had a friend and never made a friend at school. Like, this is such an unusual circumstance for them that Toriel's willing to look past them not responding to her calls. That's exactly what I thought when I played chapter 1 the first time. I think that's what most of you thought. However, what about Noelle and Des to an extent? We see in the flashback that Tenna shows us that the Holiday and the Dreamer family are like two peas in a pod. At least they were. And Noelle does talk about how Kris has grown distant from them. And yeah, I understand. Sometimes you cannot see someone for a while and you guys can still just start chatting up again like you're best friends and like nothing has changed. But I don't know. Something just feels off with the way Toriel reacted to that. Toriel, in the entirety of the game, I'm pretty fucking sure, doesn't mention Noelle one single time. Here's my theory. I think that Kris was probably such good friends with their brother Asriel and spent so much time with him that Des, by proxy, kind of ended up becoming their best friend. There's one specific set of dialogue when you're going through Des's room in chapter 4 that has really stuck with me for this theory, and I'm gonna bring it up again later for a completely different reason.
Rollerblades, wiffle bat, looking at these things makes your head hurt.
There's a lot of evidence to support that Asriel and Des had at least a semi-romantic relationship and were probably spending all of their time together. Also, no one seems to talk about Des while Kris is actually around. And I do think it is realistic that a lot of adults don't want to bring up a horrific traumatic event around children because it's just kind of easier to not talk about it. I have to deal with a teenager's complicated emotions about reacting to someone's death/disappearance for the first time. The amount of pranks that Kris seemed to pull on Noelle, like, it seems like Kris and Des were really good friends and Noelle was kind of just there by proxy because she's Des's sister, and it kind of seems like Kris saw her as a good punching bag, someone to constantly mess around and joke with and scare. And I guess this is another form of like abuse that you could say Noelle suffered. In chapter 2 with the little mouse puzzles and everything, it seems to genuinely trigger Noelle when we continue to make the mouses jump up her skirt and scare her. I guess it would make more sense Toriel having this strong of a reaction to Kris making a friend what she acts like is the first time would make a lot more sense if Kris has been a lot more lonely and isolated from everyone, including Noelle recently, and being such a loner because the best friend they had previously died and their brother went off to college. I want to make it very clear that I do actually think Noelle and Kris were very close, or at least Noelle thinks they were when they were younger. Sometimes when you're a kid and you kind of have unresolved trauma, even if it's not that serious, a major traumatic event like the disappearance of your sister in a mystery that seems to be unsolvable can kind of make that previous unresolved trauma, even though it's nothing major, weigh down on you and really affect your daily life, your personality, how you view your relationships with those people that were involved. I think the relationship between Noelle and Kris is going to be one of the most important throughout the game going forward, but I will discuss a little bit more about that later, because I think the relationship between those two directly correlates to the existence of the soul in the game. If my theory about this ends up being correct and we get to see that Kris and Des were a lot more closer than we think, if Des does end up being the Roaring Knight, the relationship between Kris and the Knight would kind of make a lot more sense. And as we learn from the chapter 4 Weird Route ending, Carol is the person that Kris has been talking to on the phone, and at the ending of the chapter 4 normal route, they remind Kris that they promised. Promise what? Probably promised to help Carol in some sort of way try to get Des back. Back to the Susie segment of this. Sorry for that. Toriel, I think, subconsciously kind of starts to maybe think about replacing Asriel with Susie. I mean, she literally gives Susie Asriel's outfit to wear. She really treats Susie like she's one of her own kids and seems to understand that Kris feels very close to Susie. This is all kind of completely destroyed with the ending of chapter 4. I don't know how long this video has been going for this point, but this is probably the #1 thing that people were most interested to hear me talk about. Sorry you had to wait this long. I really appreciate you watching. I hope I didn't bore you. I am a bit biased for my love for Susie as a character because she reminds me so much of my fiance. I know a lot of people say they relate to a fictional character, but even just down to the mannerisms and the way she acts, Susie reminds me exactly of how my fiance first acted when I met her around that age. And the visible detachment she has from the situation at the end of chapter 4 when she comes to Kris's home and Toriel is dancing with this weird guy from the convenience store who's been awfully kind of rude to her and Kris and is drunk as a fucking skunk falling off her ass and shit is just so heartbreaking. The moment they open the door, Susie's entire demeanor changes. You gotta remember, the ending of chapter 4 just happened. They just killed a Titan and everything. She just learned, quote unquote, the real ending of the prophecy. Where I'll say just had like his third mental breakdown of the chapter. It probably was the last thing that she needed on her mind, same with Kris. And instantly, once I saw what was going on, I just said to myself, oh, this is gonna remind Susie of her home life, and she's not gonna feel safe around Toriel ever again, knowing that she drinks alcohol. Even if Toriel didn't drink like she is in this scene, I still think it would have made Susie incredibly uncomfortable enough to the point where she'd probably really never want to go over to Kris's house again. I remember I had a scenario like this with my fiance when we were younger because she grew up with an alcoholic parent, and I could always just tell how uncomfortable and traumatic it was to kind of be around an adult who she felt that she could trust in that state, because deep down she knew that when someone started drinking, they were going to change, and almost definitely not for the better. Toriel doesn't seem like she becomes a mean or violent person when she's drunk. She just turns into a goofy-ass bitch. More evidence to support that comes from Rudy talking about just how fucked up Toriel would get back when her, Asgore, and Carol went to college together. I am really fucking curious how that dynamic worked between those four. I do think it's a little crazy that Kris and Susie were missing for that long that day, and she did nothing about it, was just gonna end up going to choir practice, but then Sans, and by the way, if you don't know who Sans is, he's the guy who works at the convenience store in Hometown. He's kind of a blink and you'll miss it thing. Pulled her out and said, come home. It's really weird. We see as Kris looks out the window, Susie just immediately walks away and seems to go sleep where and to go feel at home where. We have no idea. I do honestly think that Susie has been the victim of either A, self-harm, or B, physical abuse, given how when it's revealed in chapter 4 that Kris just has a fucking blood stain in their room, Susie is immediately not weirded out by this and instead immediately knows how to help Kris clean this up, and they do. Also, another weird thing that Toriel didn't notice. And Susie perfectly explains why she acts the way she acts and puts on this intimidating front, because she feels like she has to do it to protect herself. If she wasn't the one hurting people, she was the one going to get hurt. She had to act scary because she was scared. Trusting people is something that is very hard for her. This is the reason why when Ralsei is revealed to have been withholding information from Susie, she gets so fucking upset in chapter 4. Justified crash out. Despite everything that Susie has suffered and the probably awful childhood she has, deep down, she is still an incredibly heroic and kind person who actually cares about others' safety. When she sees the knight, it is on sight. It is crazy how it seems like she just wants to attack everything in chapter 1, not because she wants to kill them, she can't kill them. She's just attacking the monsters in the dark world because she feels angry. I think there is a big reason why Susie felt so heartbroken after learning the truth about the old man, aka Gerson Boom, the fucking goat. He's a turtle actually, but you know. Gerson is really the only person that tries to teach Susie anything. I mean, Ralsei does, but he's just trying to teach her the rules of the dark world and everything, while Gerson is trying to teach Susie kind of how to break them. While Susie finds Gerson annoying at first, I think she genuinely loves and respects that Gerson seems to actually understand Susie. Gerson understands the weight and the importance of destiny and forging your own path, and I think that's all Susie's ever really wanted. It really does seem like Susie is kind of looking for a parental father figure, and when she finds out that Gerson is in fact dead, it really seems to crush her, and she hopes that they can take Gerson back to Castletown and she could interact with him there. It makes sense that at the very least the prophecy implies that all the dark fountains will be closed and Susie will never be able to go back there, and that's one reason she has such a strong reaction to it and says that Kris, Ralsei, and her will never let that happen, is because Gerson is another person that she'd never be able to see again. And it really seems like his kind of fatherly wisdom and advice and rapport with her meant a lot to Susie because she's never had that in real life. And if you literally look at Susie as the main character, the main hero, the protagonist of Deltarune and everything, with her kind of conventional story arc in a way, it really does enforce again to me, and it should for you, that Deltarune is ultimately about CA and that childhood trauma. Some people have the theory that the only characters whose choices are going to matter in the end is Susie, with her kind of being able to break the path of the game a little bit. Remember, Ralsei apparently basically just knows how this is all going to go. He's basically watching a movie with people who haven't seen it for the first time, but he has. And there's a lot of things that happen throughout the story where Ralsei is not prepared for them to happen because that's not how they're supposed to go down, that really seem to bother him, and all of them have to do with Susie. Again, I think Toby Fox kind of wrote this story and included a lot of the whole dark fountain escapism metaphors, specifically for the character of Susie, to show how you can break away from your trauma and become something greater than you even imagined, and that your choices do matter and that you do have control of the situation. If there's one character in this game that I hope gets a happy ending, it is her. I'm gonna get into the more serious stuff now, but I want to say, if you've enjoyed this video so far, my videos fluctuate way too much in performance for any actual companies to want to do sponsorships with me, and I have put out videos for literal years without ever having a Patreon open. But if you would like early access videos, private Discord calls with me, exclusive role in my community Discord, follow back on social media of your choice, all the tiers are for an affordable price in the description, and it would literally mean the world to me. It would allow me to make the experimental content that I make without really worrying about the algorithm, or just following any of the links in the description supporting me would absolutely mean the world as well. As this video gets darker yet darker, I also just wanted to say there's a song that I have been working on that is mostly inspired by forms of CA that I experienced and how that's affected my adult life and the person I am today. It's a small preview, and of course don't feel afraid to leave critiques on what I can do better with this video and that song.
It's always funny when it's not happening to you. If you think I'm wrong now, one day you'll learn the truth. Abuse, tie up bad news. I'm a recluse. I am of no use. The thoughts in my head might as well be real, 'cause the feelings in my soul I don't wanna feel.
Alright, it's time to talk about Kris and Wiztale now. Now, you might be saying to yourself, Kris and Wiztale hasn't been a victim of CA. He's literally just a darkener, as we find out. He didn't have a childhood, did he? No, I don't think he did. I don't think Wiztale has a family or anything like that. But I do think Wiztale is a manifestation of psychological trauma from someone suffering CA. So, this is the part of the video where you guys are gonna have to bear with me a little bit. Basically, everything I've said in this video has had tons of strong evidence behind it. This is where I'm going to dive a little bit into like Pat game theory levels of maybe jumping to conclusions. Really quickly, to kind of support my theory, I want to talk about a few things that I think inspired Deltarune and its theming slash messaging. I think the themes and forms of CA, and even as they get revealed in later chapters, are going to continue to be mostly subtle in Deltarune. But this also kind of reminds me of Earthbound. Obviously was a massive inspiration for everything Toby Fox did, specifically for Undertale. And if you look at the kids that you play as and control at Earthbound, and you kind of look at their family background, same kind of goes for Mother 3, you're just kind of like, well, that's not right. Also, there's that Homestuck thing I've heard about. I've heard Toby Fox may have been a fan of that. Who is to say? Another thing that I think inspired Deltarune was the cult classic Twin Peaks. There are a lot of similarities between the characters of Laura Palmer and Noelle Holiday, and December Holiday as well, and just kind of the general vibes of Deltarune, with it being this small town where everybody knows each other, but nobody really knows each other. And the fact that there's certain weird things in the town that people just seem to not want to talk about, even though they probably should. And if the theories about Des being the Roaring Knight turn out to be true, it would kind of remind me of the concept of tulpas from Twin Peaks, where the worst part of someone's being manifested into one, so much so to the point where it completely takes control of them, and that's all they are anymore. We know that Des had a kind of a weird method about disciplining Kris whenever they did something that they didn't approve of.
What? She was eating the chalk? Really? Wait. You're teasing me, aren't you, Kris? Like when you told me Icy was real and eats kids. So, Des smacked you with a wiffle bat till you stopped lying?
And I kind of wonder if the Roaring Knight is going to be a manifestation of the possible CA that Kris suffered at the hands of Des. My favorite television show, and the greatest television show of all time, Mr. Robot, has the main theme of control is an illusion. Now, at first, this whole theme of control is an illusion really seems like it's meant to be talking about technology and how it kind of strips away humanity from the modern world, and we're so addicted to our computers and social media and smartphones, we kind of let them control us without us even realizing it, as well as the concept of the invisible hand, which refers to all of the powerful politicians and corporations that kind of decide what the paths in our lives are going to be without us even really realizing it. But as the mysteries of the show unravel, and by the way, general sweeping spoilers for Mr. Robot, I made a video about it on my second channel. If you want to be convinced to go watch it, please watch it. As the show starts to develop, it really shows that the theme of control as an illusion has a lot more to do with our main character, Elliot, and the abuse they suffered as a child. Elliot is a character kind of like Kris, who is always constantly fighting for control of their situation and never fully fully being able to achieve it, except for in the case of Mr. Robot, where Elliot finally learns about and remembers the trauma he suffered as a child. Only then is he able to accept who he is on the inside and finally overcome it, finally having control of his mind and his body. It's absolutely beautiful the way it's done, and trust me, knowing this will not like make any of the show works to you. Now, I cannot prove that Toby Fox has seen Mr. Robot or hell even knows what it is, but I am unshakably certain that he has seen this show, watched it all the way through, and there are some things about this show that 1000% inspired Deltarune. I see people make those TikTok edits about like characters they think that would have the freedom motif, and let me tell you, the character of Mr. Robot would rank very high. I really want to talk about one specific aspect of Mr. Robot that when I'm playing Deltarune, I can't get out of my head. It bothers me so much because I keep questioning to myself, is the relationship between Kris and Ralsei supposed to be like the relationship between Elliot and Mr. Robot? Mr. Robot, the titular character in the show, is a hallucination of the main character, Elliot Alderson, of Elliot's real-life dead father. Elliot is a character who has DID, dissociative identity disorder, and the way that this narrative device is used in the show is so interesting because Elliot and Mr. Robot are the same person, technically. They're two personalities trying to co-opt one body, one mind. So why does Elliot have dissociative identity disorder? Why does Mr. Robot even exist? Without giving too much away, Mr. Robot was created as kind of a protector for Elliot. The existence of the separate personality of Mr. Robot exists because of abuse that Elliot suffered at the hands of his actual real father. When there's something that Elliot physically or emotionally couldn't handle, that's when Mr. Robot took over, or at least got involved, trying to protect Elliot from the worst. So it kind of makes me wonder, is that what's been going on with Ralsei and Kris? Like I said earlier in the video, I think that the Dark Fountains are a psychological manifestation of the person who creates them. So let's say I'm right for a moment. In Chapter 1 of Deltarune, there are actually two present Dark Fountains. At the end of Chapter 1, we close the Dark Fountain, inadvertently closing Card Castle and the surrounding areas. We see this as we end up in the classroom to the right of the Dark Fountain, a host Castletown. And the way that Ralsei speaks when we first meet him kind of implies that he's been here for a long time. And also we see throughout the game that Ralsei kind of has an ability to just like travel between Dark Fountains very seamlessly. Anytime we end up coming and leaving through a Dark Fountain, regardless of which one it is, he is always able to appear there relatively instantly. I promise this actually does matter who created the Dark Fountains at the start of the game in order to figure out who actually did. There's a very hidden character we need to talk about, and that is the existence of Seam, or Sham, cat motherfucker. Obviously, Seam is the first shopkeeper that we see in Chapter 1, and of course he comes back to our Castletown after the first Dark Fountain is closed, and we can learn a lot of very interesting things from him. In Chapter 4, however, when we're exploring on Asriel's computer, we learn that Asriel and Kris actually made Seam the little puppet. When we first beat Chapter 1, we can see him on the floor in this room, and because Toriel was a school teacher here, I would imagine that Kris and Asriel would probably play here as children after school, and that Seam just got left here one day by one of them. It seems like a lot of the objects in the dark world that come from the light world kind of retain memories of what happened around them. So why doesn't Seam remember anything about Kris and Asriel? He speaks to you legitimately like he's meeting you for the first time, yet he has all this weird information about the Shadow Crystal and John Mantle. One weird thing about all the dark worlds is they have this implied past history. Seam talks about his relationship with Jevil and how Jevil went crazy, so the king had him imprisoned away. It's so weird that these dark worlds were apparently just poof created out of thin air, but all of these beings in the dark world that are just manifestations of objects from the light world have this weird history and lore. A lot of people have theories that Kris has been in the dark worlds before. When you go to the first save point in the first dark world in Chapter 1, Kris's name is already on it. Is this just meant to show that you are taking over control for Kris, or is it literally showing us that Kris had been here before? You could say the reason that Seam doesn't have a memory of Kris is because someone else created the Dark Fountain and Seam just happened to be in that room. And isn't it interesting that a toy that Asriel and Kris created that for some reason doesn't ever bring up Asriel and doesn't talk to Kris like he knows us is imbued with such importance in this game. And when you don't get any of the Shadow Crystals, he seems to become depressed and lose hope. Given that all of the secret bosses have some sort of ties to the theme of freedom, and Seam himself ultimately does as well, I think that the reason Seam has such importance tells us a lot given the fact that Asriel and Kris literally created him. But if we're specifically talking about inside of the Dark Worlds, we don't know who created Seam/Sham, but I think we can figure out who created Ralsei. We see this door in Chapter 1, we go through it, and then we end up in the Card Castle Dark Fountain in the right side of this hallway in the school. We don't see this door appear again until chapter 4, when we are traveling to a dark fountain that had already pre-existed the one that we currently were in. Ralsei even says as much as the most recent Card Castle Dark Fountain popped up recently. Seam doesn't exist in the Castle Town Dark Fountain. He only pops up in the Card Castle Dark Fountain. Now, I could go on, and I'll say that originally in this section, I was going to say that I think Asriel is actually the one who created either the Castle Town or Card Castle Dark Fountain, and I'll explain why all this is important, but I actually think this isn't true. I think someone unbeknownst to us is the person who created the Card Castle Dark Fountain, and I think Kris is the person who created Castle Town. The name of the soundtrack is literally My Castle Town. Come on. But it all begs a question when it comes to Ralsei then, and to quote Mr. Robot,
why are you here? I didn't ask what you do, I asked you why you here. How did you start?
Earlier in this section, when I first started recording this video like 3 months ago, I had originally thought that perhaps Kris was abused by Asriel, or just suffered a general amount of neglect from their parents, Asgore and Toriel, but looking through the game, it genuinely seems like Asgore and Toriel did a lot to make Kris feel normal. Despite them being the only human living in a town of monsters, they tried to make them feel like part of the family. More so, I don't think anything necessarily happened to Kris when they were at least living with the Dreamers. I think there might just be something inherently wrong with Kris though. Also, why is it every single time we are told a story about Kris and Asriel, it's about when they were like little kids? Stories that Alvin, the priest, tells you, stories that your mother tells you, even everything that Tenna talks about. Kinda weird that Asriel's supposed to be of college age, like a grown adult, yet the only stories we ever hear about their interactions with Kris are from when the time when Asriel was probably like, I don't know, 11 or something around that age. Isn't it interesting that Ralsei doesn't look like the age Asriel should be right now? He looks more similar to Kris's age. If Kris did create Ralsei, subconscious psychological manifestation or not, why is Ralsei specifically around the age that Kris probably has the best memories of Asriel from? All of these stories are from when they were so young, and is it possible that the relationship that Kris and Asriel had only really was good when they were younger, before Asriel grew up, started to be the most popular kid in the town? Asriel probably had less and less time to spend with Kris, so is it possible that somehow Kris created the first Dark Fountain and made Ralsei a kind of perfect time capsule of the memories that Kris had of spending time with their brother when they were younger? There's one more giant question though. Kris created Ralsei, and Ralsei knows the entirety of the prophecy. How is that? I mean, we do know that Deltarune is like a religion in the hometown. They learn about Lancer the same way we learn about Jesus. But parts of the prophecy have always been scattered and lost to time. But does Kris know, like, the actual entirety of the prophecy? And if so, how did that happen? We know that Kris is definitely hiding a lot from Susie and us, the player. And if the Roaring Knight ends up being Des, I can guarantee that Kris had a hand somehow in whatever happened to Des. Is it possible that Des was perhaps a bit abusive and controlling of Kris, and Des was someone like Kris who had intrusive violent thoughts, and when she found out that Kris made the Dark Fountain, she decided to make more with them? Maybe Asriel wasn't even the one who was originally exploring the Dark Fountains with Kris or creating them, but it was Des the whole time. These two who cared so deeply for their siblings, but as they got older started to feel like they couldn't connect to them anymore. Maybe they were just two people with bad thoughts they couldn't control. I go into this more in my most recent video talking about the whole Asgore running over Des meme. Yes, I did like a serious theory breakdown of that. Okay, look, go ahead and watch that if you want to know more about what I actually think Des might have been like as a person, and just more about Asgore and his whole role in the entire story of Deltarune and Undertale for that matter. So yes, I am telling you on top of however fucking long this video is to go watch like another 26-minute video. I promise you'll enjoy it. In the game files, there is some sort of lost girl, some sort of lost voice, and 100% from this dialogue and everything we know about Des, it seems that she is the one who is truly lost. Did Kris do something to her as a punishment? Is that why in Spamton's shop, when Spamton's talking to the lost voice, he says that the voice was trying to speak to Kris? What did Kris promise Carol? Do they know something about how to bring Des back? Did Kris and their violent intrusiveness retaliate against Des in some sort of way in the dark world? And is that truly the guilt they feel? Because eventually what they did will come to light. In the chapter 3 S-Room minigames, we basically get a tutorial on how to start or do the weird route. And specifically in this route, we see Kris kill Ralsei and Susie. I mean, it was required for them to get stronger so that they could progress through the minigame and get the Shadow Mantle. And they look away, either because they don't want to look at the screen while we're doing this, or to make sure that Susie or Ralsei don't accidentally walk in on them, which is something that happens later. I wonder if it's possible that Kris has abandonment issues, like really bad. And ever since Azriel started spending a lot of time with Des and Pizza/Burger Pants and other people around the town, Kris just felt incredibly lonely and isolated. It's really common with children who are adopted and have another sibling to feel just some sort of weird resentment towards their parents that they can't explain. Even though Asgore and Toriel did a pretty good job making Kris feel loved and welcomed in their home and like part of the family, they still probably gave more love to Azriel overall. So in a weird way, Kris probably felt somehow still like second rate to Azriel. Kris would never be their real child. And that does ultimately make you look at your adopted parents differently. I know I've been putting a lot of like specific little details and screenshots and quotes on screen, but I really want to talk about two very specific things vocally. Now, it's actually a really cool Easter egg that Toby Fox put in a fighting game that seems to have different video game mascots inside of it. This game that Toby Fox put in Deltarune was actually brought up during a conversation with Masahiro Sakurai, and this would later go on to inspire the infamous Super Smash Bros. Franchise, for those who didn't know. But we learned that Azriel and Kris used to play this game, and their parents actually bought a knockoff controller for Kris to play with. However, Azriel specifically chose to play with the knockoff one and let Kris have the real one to make them feel more special and not like an afterthought to an extent. I think Azriel was the main person in the family that made Kris feel the most welcome and feel the least like an outcast. So Azriel goes to college and stops spending as much time with Kris over the years, and I imagine that probably hurt Kris a lot. We don't know anything about Kris's real family or parents, and we never learn the reason that Kris lives with the Dreamers and is the only human in this town. I'd like to think that they were adopted, but is it possible that Kris was maybe found abandoned by their parents and the Dreamers took them in? Kris is definitely a loner, and everyone kind of sees them as a freak, just like another character. And some of the Noelle holiday blogs that got released by Toby Fox years ago, we find out about an interesting interaction that happened between our two favorite freaks of the town, Kris and Susie, and I'm gonna assume this is before we, the player, the soul, inhabits Kris.
So that new girl I keep talking about, she really hates Kris. And you know what's weird? Literally only Kris seems oblivious to this. Or no. Are they oblivious? They're literally getting bullied. Do they just not care? Then again, who knows what Kris is thinking? I just don't get why they don't tell their mom. Or better, switch seats with me, like I keep saying, lol. I guess they just don't want to be at the front of the class, but she doesn't ever bully me, even when there'd be a huge opportunity to. So come on, switch seats. Everyone would be safer that way. Like, you're not going to believe what happened today. After the bell rang, as usual, everyone rushed to see who could get out of class first. I stayed behind a bit to help Alphys put away some books. Meanwhile, Kris was still asleep, face down on a totally blank notebook page, and for some reason, Susie hadn't left either. She was just sitting there staring at Kris's head, sniffing it. Eventually, I started to leave too. I even almost said bye this time. But I was a bit worried about Kris, so I stayed outside the classroom to watch. I had to stay totally out of sight, holiday family ninja style, since Susie didn't seem like she was going to do anything until she made sure I was gone. After a while, Susie got up, knocking her chair over. She jumped into Miss Alphys' seat and put her shoes up on the desk, getting dirt everywhere. She grabbed the apple Berdly had given Alphys a few days ago, held it up, and started talking.
Hey, idiot.
Kris didn't look up.
Hey, idiot.
Kris still didn't look up.
Kris.
Kris looked up. Susie rolled her eyes and showed all of her horrible and very cool teeth.
Nice shampoo. Apple flavor, right? Better be careful about wearing that around me.
Then she bit the whole apple in half, including the core. She even ate the seeds, which contain arsenic if you didn't know. Don't eat those, Susie. Anyway, Kris didn't react, so she continued.
Keep smelling like apples. You might end up like this.
Kris didn't react.
Bitten. In half.
There was like the most awkward silence. And then snickering? But it wasn't Susie. No, it was Kris. just barely stifling some laugh. Did they think that was some kind of weird joke? Whatever it was, Susie must have thought she was getting made fun of because she immediately just launched the apple right at Kris. But Kris, with their gamer reaction speed, held up their notebook like a shield and blocked it diagonally, bouncing it into the air, and actually caught the apple and took a bite out of it. Gosh, though, did that make Susie mad.
You little.
She ran over and grabbed Kris by the hair, staring into their face really close. I froze. I knew that if I didn't do anything, Kris would get hurt or worse. But something inside of me just froze. I just stood there holding my breath and Susie kept talking.
One day, your mom's gonna get sick of you, you little freak. And as soon as that happens,
Susie laughed. I felt genuinely sick.
someone might make you disappear, and she'll finally realize how happy she was without you.
After all that, Kris didn't say anything at all. Susie exploded.
Say something, you idiot!
Felt like her voice echoed around the room forever. Then, when it finally went quiet, Kris's mouth looked like it had moved. To be honest, moved so slightly I couldn't even tell if they said something or what. But whatever it was, Susie's attitude suddenly completely changed. She let go of Kris, backing off quickly, then left the room in such a hurry she would have easily won today's leaving first race. I really wish I could have seen her reaction, but I was so scared she would see me that I literally just jumped into my locker. In the end, all I could see through the little slats was her shape from behind, going towards the entrance of the school with her head held low. Finally, I heard the entrance door close. I sighed, and suddenly all that frozen feeling that had built up in my chest flew out of my body all at once. Holy cheese and crackers, I said to myself. I almost started laughing from relief. Then suddenly my locker's door flung open. Kris was standing there. I started to stutter hello, and they just slowly shut the door on me and left. Well, that just happened, LOL. I ordered apple shampoo. Maybe if I wear it too, she won't bother Kris as much.
Toby Fox has gone on record saying that, like, the Spampton sweepstakes and the Holiday Girl blog stuff, all that is just, like, companionship material to Deltarune. It's just kind of, like, fun little Easter eggs in there for people who just want to learn a little bit more about the world and everything. I think this is another one of the tumultuous Tony tricks, and I think that they are a lot more important, and he's lying. There's just way too many intimate details that we learn from Noelle, and specifically about her relationship with Kris, and why it felt so special to her, even though her and Kris, while they were close, didn't really seem to know each other. Now, I cannot prove what Kris said, we can only theorize. I feel like Kris said something cruel that made Susie cry in this scenario. Something along the lines of, well, at least I have a mother. Or was it perhaps something a bit darker than that, where Kris told Susie, go ahead, do it. I don't want to be alive anymore anyways. And Susie related to that, perhaps? It freaked her out. I think that moment where Toriel buys Susie the hot chocolate after finding her crying on the bench was really, really important to Susie. And Susie, who's never really formed any connections with anyone, moving from town to town, never ever getting to actually make friendships, perhaps even having to move in with different foster parents, probably felt such a warm, genuine connection to Toriel. And the fact that her child is Kris, this little freak, probably made her feel super, super jealous of Kris, because Susie deep down probably wishes Toriel is the foster parent that she had. She would have given probably anything to feel like an outcast, quote unquote, in the Dreamer household. It would have been a million times better than what she's probably been dealing with. It'd be very interesting to think that Susie and Kris have become so close if their relationship started in such a kind of toxic manner, but that's actually also how my relationship between my fiance and I started. She would bully me, I would bully her back, but then we both kind of realized why we were bullying each other, and it's because we were really similar people at our core. Speaking of core, both these freaks just eat the whole apple core at different points in time. Like, they just eat an entire apple. That's another parallel between the two anyways. It's not that important, I just want to point it out. So what does any of this have to do with Ralsei? I think ultimately this interaction really just shows how before we came along, even, presumably, Kris really doesn't do well on their own, and they need some sort of figure watching over them, making sure that they control themselves. I think that's a large part in why Ralsei was created. Could you imagine how the entirety of Chapter 1 would go if it was just Kris and Susie exploring the Dark Worlds with Lancer? As much as Ralsei can be a good teacher and influence on someone like Susie, he can also be that for someone like Kris. However, I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention that I feel like there's a reason that Ralsei's name is simply just Ralsei, not just Asriel 2. And Ralsei doesn't just look exactly like Asriel. Kris and Ralsei have this little exchange in chapter 3, and depending on the dialogue options you choose, it kind of seems like the player, the soul, is trying to imply that Ralsei looks similar to Asriel. Kris doesn't seem to think so. When you're in your house and hometown chapter 4 and you're running around with Susie, you can go up to the fridge and look at a picture of you and your brother. Susie gets weirded out and immediately says, wow, Ralsei looks really similar to Asriel, don't you think? Kris, 100%. Does not agree with this. It really seems like Kris mentally likes to keep Ralsei and Asriel as separate entities in their head. They don't like to see them compared. When Kris is looking through all of the stuff in Des's room, this text box ends off with, looking at this makes your head hurt. Why? Well, my initial thought, as was most people's, is that Kris feels a strong level of guilt from what happened to Des. It's obviously implied that some of the stuff in this box that we're looking through belong to Asriel. What if the reason that looking at this stuff makes your head hurt is not because of guilt, but because of trauma? Kris is being reminded of something that happened to them that they wish didn't. It's really interesting given the characterization that Asriel is given in Undertale. You gotta remember, Undertale is a parallel story to Deltarune. There's no way getting around that, and Asriel Dreamer's name is still an anagram for serial murderer. I don't really love putting a theory out in the world of this character is secretly evil, and I don't think that Asriel's evil. CA is a very complicated thing, especially with siblings. And sometimes things are done very unintentionally, especially with emotional abuse from siblings, that when you're like a teenager and have a younger sibling, sometimes you don't realize how the things you do affect your younger sibling until you're older, and maybe we'll see what happened more with that later on. I think Ralsei is supposed to be kind of like a Mr. Robot figure to Kris. The reason Kris doesn't like when people compare Asriel and Ralsei is because Ralsei is a manifestation of what Kris wanted Asriel to be, or continue to be. Everything we know about Asriel still suggests he's a sensitive soft boy, similar to Ralsei, and I'm very curious to see just how much of an intentional misdirect this was or not. I hope that wasn't too convoluted, but to me, there is even one relationship that is more interesting than the relationship between Kris and Ralsei's existence, and that is the existence of the soul. In my opinion, for me to ultimately prove that Deltarune is about CA, I really do think the strongest argument is that we, the player, can actively abuse children throughout the game. Before getting into lore bullshit, I don't think it's bullshit. I think it's fascinating, actually. I really like this game's lore, okay. Before getting into that, we need to discuss the fact that Kris is a non-binary character. Now, I know there are some people who probably watched this entire fucking video all the way up to this point and will only now click off for some reason, but whatever. Kris being non-binary is not just like a funny, quirky thing about them. It's not just in the game for LGBTQ cool points. I do believe Toby Fox wants to promote diversity in his games. That's very obvious and really cool. But Kris being non-binary is very specific to this character. Kris clearly doesn't like to be perceived by people, and even from a young age, it really seems like they have struggled to fit in. Now, obviously, when we're inhabiting Kris, they won't really talk, but it also doesn't really seem like they used to too much either. In the Weird Route section of chapter 4, Noelle talks about how Kris started speaking normally again to them. It sounded like their real voice and not the one that she heard in her dream, or so she thinks. It doesn't make it sound like Kris was talking a lot or anything. It really seems like they just said what they needed to say, tried to warn Noelle before it was too late, and that was about it. There is a lot to suggest that Kris has some violent, intrusive thoughts in the game. Furthermore, there's a decent amount of evidence to suggest that Kris had self-harmed prior to the events of the first chapter. And I think some of that, not all of it, is attributed to the fact I think Kris really doesn't know who they are as a person. And I think around people that made them feel comfortable, like at the very least Asriel, they felt more like someone. And I think that's another reason why the relationship with Susie is so important to them. Throughout the game, we can choose to be really nice to Ralsei, or we can kind of just choose to be cold towards them, but it always ends up being our choice. The only times really that we ever see Kris act without us doing anything for them is in relationship to Susie, whether it be protecting them, goofing off with them, things like that. And only in the Chapter 4 Weird Route will Kris finally start to truly fight back against us, the player, when we're actually still in control of them. The whole them ripping their heart out of themselves, ripping us out of them, seems to be caused by them harming themselves. I feel like every single time Kris, I guess, disobeys us and does something that we don't tell them to do, I have a feeling it literally has to cause them physical pain in order for them to do that, to rip away from the strings guiding their hand. All of this stuff with self-harm and our control obviously plays into the theory that Kris will at some point, maybe by choice, cut off their own hand to somehow get rid of our control. I'm not exactly sure how that will work, but it's an interesting theory, right? But in my opinion, Kris is already trying to harm themselves to regain control over us. Remember that thing about the apple core I mentioned earlier? It actually was important. Crazy, right? In this scene where Kirsten does the little tea party and is definitely trying to ascertain more information about who Kris is as a person by giving them the tea and kind of talking to them. Only in the Snowgrave Weird Route version of Chapter 4 will Kris just eat the entire apple core if it is presented to them. Some people have the theory about like food in the dark world isn't real food, and actually we haven't seen Kris eat for like the entirety of the chapter, so perhaps we're starving them. And at first I thought that's the reason they just ate the entirety of the apple, including the core, because they're so hungry, but even then, Ralsei mentions, oh, you shouldn't do that, that's not a good thing to do, because apple cores contain cyanide and are poisonous, and if you ingest enough of it, you'll die. Take that as you will on what Kris's intentions are. The first time we really see Kris, like, actively fight back against us and do something while we're still currently controlling them is in the Chapter 3 Weird Route when they approach the bunker. They immediately start moving the opposite direction from us with their controller. They do not want us to go inside of it, even though it's just this weird fucked up video game that Ram made. And then obviously in Chapter 4, they start taking a much more direct approach about fighting back against us. Near the end of Chapter 4, when Susie asks us about playing the piano and we say we'll never play again, Kris literally bites their own hand. Susie's like, well, what the hell's going on, my dog? She never actually says anything about what we said because we didn't say anything. We didn't say, I'll never play the piano again. Kris stopped us from making them say that. It really seems like Kris's ability and talent for the piano is one of the only things they truly know about themselves. Noelle even mentions in one of her blogs that Kris wouldn't even let her watch them play, but would let her listen when they came over to her house. Through all of the egg stuff, we find out it seemed like Kris was doing some sort of art therapy, and I'm assuming Asgore and Toriel signed them up for that specifically. It just seems like creativity and art are real coping mechanisms for Kris, or at the very least meditative, something that makes them feel sane and distracts them from the violent thoughts that they do have. It's obvious that the entirety of Deltarune is incredibly personal to its creator, Tobias Fox. He even said that the scene where Susie picks up Kris and slams them against the locker is actually, like, inspired by a real bully he had in real life. Interesting. And obviously Toby Fox loves music, and the chords of a piano especially. I think that's one reason that there's so much imagery and importance placed on music and pianos in this game. After Asriel going away and whatever happened to Des, I think that Kris truly feels like their love for the piano and playing is one of the only things they have left. I'm assuming they fell into a depression after whatever happened with Des and Asriel leaving, and that's the reason apparently they haven't played in so long. More so, I think it's another interesting commentary on what we, the soul, are actually capable of. In a very meta way, we, the player, presumably most of us, don't know how to play the piano. Yeah, there's that one giant piano where we can input funny songs into it and everything, and you can actually kind of play the piano. The game is designed with the assumption that you don't, or at the very least that we wouldn't be as talented as Kris is. When we let Kris play the piano, we have to completely relinquish control to let them do that. I think it's very interesting that this dark world was designed with a section where Kris playing the piano is literally required to progress. And I'm sure that the option to have let Kris play the piano of their free will on their own would never have come up if it wasn't literally required to beat the game. So Kris is putting themselves through like physical torture, it seemed, to stop us from doing things that they heavily disapprove of and feel uncomfortable with. Okay, got it. So, how did the soul inhabit Kris in the first place? This is the one thing that Toby Fox has purposefully, I think, tried to keep incredibly ambiguous throughout all of Deltarune. Like, obviously, yes, we're a human, we would have a soul, but the soul in Deltarune seems to be more powerful than the soul in Undertale even. Have you ever heard of a guy named Dr. Wingdings Gaster? I wanted to start this video off in a very explosive way by saying what I actually think Deltarune is about, but then I realized there's words and phrases. Nah, that bald egg-shaped cocksucker doesn't have any power here. We're coming back. If you don't know who Gaster is, how are you on this video? How did you make it this far? Thank you for watching, I appreciate it, but like, I feel like you could walk up to like any random person who's used the internet for 5 minutes in any country and just show them a picture of the mystery man, and they just be like, oh yeah, that's Wingdings Gaster. He fell into his own creation and everything while he's working on a machine in Undertale that was like fueled by the power of determination. That he's obviously the person who makes you create the vessel at the start of Deltarune. I think that the reason the soul inhabits Kris is because Kris was chosen. We create our vessel at the start of the game. Gaster tells us, hey, your choices don't matter, bub. And it literally says, your name is Kris. I think this is basically Gaster saying, no, we already have a perfect vessel in Kris. And I think what makes Kris a perfect vessel for the soul is that they're nobody. They are a complete husk of a person who feels like they have no identity. They don't know who they are. They don't feel like they belong. And also, perhaps because Kris has some thoughts they couldn't keep back, somehow the soul, or at least us, the player specifically, we found our way to Kris. And it seems like Kris understands that the soul is important. They never try to outright, like, get rid of us. Only when they specifically don't want us around, like when we're at Noelle's house or when they need to do something at night. And whatever Carol's real plan is and whatever we're helping her with in relationship to Des and probably trying to find a way to bring her back somehow, I think it will involve us closing all of the dark fountains. And we, the player, are just simply going through the motions because we have to find out what happens. Again, it's just like an Undertale. We're doing all of this because, simply put, we can, and we have to know what happens. I'd really like to know more specific fan theories in the comment section below behind how you think the soul began to inhabit Kris and why exactly Kris specifically was chosen. If you have anything to say in the comments below, go ahead and let me know your thoughts. Kris's character in Deltarune and what I imagine their arc will continue to progress as explore a lot of different forms of CA. And I think specifically the reason they have such a strong relationship with Susie and Noelle is due to the fact that both of those characters have experienced also different versions of CA that are often explored in media. What we're doing in Deltarune throughout the entirety of the game is running away and exploring, going on an adventure, just getting lost in our own dreams. And it's hard to fight back against abuse when you're so young. Sometimes that's the only thing you can do. Sometimes that's the best thing you can do. And it's very specific that a lot of the bad things that happen in the weird route, we, the player, specifically cause. Like I mentioned earlier with Berdly and some of the shit that happens to Noelle and what we're continuing to make Kris do to themselves, we the player are committing CA. It's obvious that the thorn ring literally hurts Noelle just to wear it, and it's really sad that in a way Kris can be Noelle's savior but also Noelle's tormentor, depending on the options and paths and little things you choose to do in the game. If you do this Snowgrave version of Chapter 2, in the light world, Noelle will have that thorn in her finger she was wearing the ring on, and only we, Kris, will be the one to actually pull it out of her. Even people in the town notice how Noelle is acting differently due to the things that we did to her. If the Weird Out version of Chapter 2 does not take place, Noelle becomes more fearless and confident in herself and her ability. If the Weird Out version of Chapter 2 does take place, she just becomes even more obedient, less independent, and someone who is just meek, shy, and sad and is waiting for someone else to give them an order on what to do. I like to think that, again, this is a subtle commentary on how in a lot of media, especially with female characters, there's always this whole arc of, oh, my pain made me stronger. The trauma and abuse I suffered made me into more of a strong badass. It made me a better person. And I'm very happy that Deltarune specifically is showing that that's not really how things work. Yes, there are experiences that you have to overcome in order to become more confident and independent and just happier in general. But often those experiences aren't from someone that you trust and someone that you care for, inflicting pain upon you and tormenting you like what Kris is doing to Noelle. Or rather what we the player are making Kris do to Noelle. It is very obvious that Kris doesn't want to do any of these things, but I do genuinely believe inside of Kris there is some sort of sick, morbid curiosity, at the very least at the start of the weird route, on what will happen if we make these certain decisions, what will happen if we do everything Spamton's telling us to do. Like I said earlier, I do think Kris is kind of the one who created Ralsei. Maybe not on purpose, but I think that Kris has a pretty decent understanding of what the prophecy is in its entirety. And I think Kris knows that the weird route version of chapter 2 isn't how everything was supposed to play out, really. And I think there is this sick curiosity in them that wants to see what happens. But I think by the time we get to the end of chapter 2 and whatever happened to Berdly happens, I think by that point Kris has realized that it went way too far and tries to stop it. Also, obviously, I think that it will be 100% confirmed later that Carol did have something to do with the existence of the soul in the player within Kris. I mean, she's obsessed with human souls and everything, carries a bunch of cultural appropriation artifacts around her house when it comes to humans. And I think it will be an interesting thing to see how whatever Carol did is basically them inflicting CA upon Kris, whether indirectly or directly. And it's interesting that we, the player, while controlling Kris, can inflict CA upon other characters in the game. Again, I think that being an interesting commentary on how there are cycles of abuse within people, hurt people, all that stuff. We, the player, can either choose to break the cycle or continue it. Also, it's clear that Gaster wants us to succeed. I mean, when you're fighting the knight and everything, you get these game over screens where bro is practically just cheering you on. Kris, Susie, and Ralsei are probably just a means to an end for Gaster. Whatever his experiment is, we are just a tool for him. I don't really think he cares about what happens to us in the end, but he's utterly fascinated by the different choices and routes the player can make. If you somehow manage to beat the entirety of the game without getting a single achievement, he will be fascinated in you, asking, what are you? Just being so fascinated by someone who had endless amount of choices, different routes they could take and things they could interact with, but choosing to do none of them. This is all just a game to that sadistic motherfucker, and I know it. And again, with all of this, with what we do to Noelle, and with what Gaster and Carol are doing to us, the choices don't matter. I think the main thing about Carol that's going to be really interesting going forward is just seeing how much she has actually manipulated Kris and exactly what she's done to Kris. I'm sure there will be people in the fandom and whatever that tried to justify her actions by, oh, she did it for her daughter. And if Kris was somehow involved in Dessa's disappearance, saying that Kris should be helping Carol since they're the reason Dessa's missing. But at the end of the day, Carol is an adult, Kris is a young teenager, and should know better than to get them involved in whatever they're getting them involved in. There is a big reason why some people will not do the weird route playthrough or the genocide route in Undertale, because they do not want to make other people suffer as a result of their actions. Which is a beautiful parallel, in my opinion, for the thing that ultimately separates people who are awful people who hurt others who can't protect themselves from the people who don't, which is empathy. The thing that makes you a human instead of a monster. Very obvious by the bunker opening at the end of chapter 3 that Kris has been there. I truly believe Kris already knows everything there is to know about the bunker and just cannot tell the truth to Susie. I don't think Kris expected to develop this impromptu relationship with Susie, or at least genuinely care for her as much as they do. So now they are just in an impossible position with us, the player, ultimately controlling pretty much everything. Kris can fight back as much as they would like, but as we see in the chapter 4 weird route, that only gets them so far. I think at the start of the game, when Ralsei says,
Kris, once we pass through this door, our adventure will really begin. A journey foretold exactly by the prophecy. But, Kris, I believe your choices are important too. This world is full of all kinds of people, Kris. In the end, how we treat them makes all of the difference. Let's try our best to get by without fighting. If we can manage to do that, I believe this tale may have a happy ending. Otherwise, I fear that you may not find the result favorable.
Ralsei is not talking to Kris necessarily. Ralsei is talking directly to the player at this point. Now, obviously the themes of player choice and violence were in Undertale as well, but in this game, Deltarune, I think that Toby Fox wanted to experiment with how that affects children. Think back to Undertale for a moment. What's the only child character in the game that you actually have a chance to battle? Monster Kid. Monster Kid keeps bothering us in the waterfall section of the game, and we go to fucking kill his ass, and this happens. We actually cannot end up killing Monster Kid, but we can sure do this to Berdly, and whatever the fuck this was to Noelle. So yeah, that's actually something that doesn't happen in Undertale. You do not commit a CA in Undertale, but you can do it in this game. But at the beginning of this video, I said that I would directly explain how every single character in Deltarune is linked to the themes of CA, and I was gonna prove it. God damn it, I am an orange of my words, so let's do everyone else now. Gonna keep it real with you. I don't consider characters like Temmie or Jockington characters that have an arc. So I'm only gonna talk about characters that actually have like notable moments in the game and like lines of dialogue. But I promise you, if you weren't convinced before, you will be convinced after this. Starting with Lancer. I mean, do I need to explain? Again, kind of like with Kris and Carol, sometimes another adult has to step in place for a parent who is either not around or evil, and Roxgard does just that, being the quote lesser dad for Lancer. Spamton 1000% seems to be aware of Kris's home life to a small extent. He 100% understands the power that the soul gives Kris. It allows Kris to interact with so many things in the dark world and fight them and everything, and close the dark fountains, and Spamton seems to have a real desire for that heart-shaped object. And the way the Spamton kind of talks about the characters in the game, and also just acts towards Kris in general, is a bit sketch, given that he's, you know, supposed to be like a grown man. Spamton seems to emotionally affect Kris on a level that we don't really see anything else in the game do. After the pacifist fight with Spamton, Kris genuinely starts freaking the fuck out. Ralsei, of course, tries to kind of pass it off as it being nothing, because maybe that's just what Kris wants them to do. Susie definitely notices that Kris would not be acting like this randomly unless something incredibly traumatic happened. Also, side note, I really love how through a lot of the game, Susie just seems to see Kris in a way that no one else really sees them or understands them, probably due to them both having similar trauma, which, you know, is very indicative of relationships in real life. Spamton talks about freedom and Kris breaking their strings, and it genuinely seems to be the first time that Kris really kind of realizes how fucked up their situation and relationship with the soul is, and the fact that there is nothing they can do. All they are is a cage. Spamton also seems to understand that the weird route is something that is not supposed to happen. Everything that happens in the weird route is in large part because of Spamton himself. I think that Spamton ultimately understands that Kris has some violent thoughts that they try not to act upon, and Spamton will be able to take advantage of that in order to progress the weird route, allowing them to go become Spamton Neo, and then the results of the rest of the Chapter 2 weird route playthrough take place. If my theory about Noelle having made the Chapter 2 Dark Fountain is correct, and having created Spamton is correct, then this line of dialogue insinuates to me that Noelle, at the very least, has an understanding of the depression that Kris feels inside their soul.
Well, you're fucking right, but don't blame me when you're crying in a broken home, wishing you let your old pal Spamton
kill you.
Spamton, again, might be an entity similar to Carol that is willing to take advantage of the darkness inside of Kris to further their own goals. Tenna absolutely kind of seems to be a reflection of childhood trauma. In a lot of ways, old television is very nostalgic for people, as it's a thing that feels kind of trapped in a period of time, and we don't really have anything like old TV nowadays and old video games. And that's ultimately a lot of what Tenna is supposed to represent, is the fear of becoming obsolete. Spamton's already had to live through this fear while Tenna hasn't quite accepted it yet. And I'm not sure if Tenna is purposefully trying to taunt Kris by bringing up traumatic childhood memories, or doesn't realize how much those things have bothered Kris. We know for a fact that Kris did create the Chapter 3 Dark Fountain, so it does make sense that Tenna would have knowledge of all of these things. So what does it say about Kris that Tenna ends up saying these things to them? I think it's just another example of Kris having intrusive thoughts that is very realistic for someone who had a lot of CA growing up. Sometimes you just kind of blink and close your eyes and it just flashes into your head, just like a synaptic flashbang being projected into your vision in your mind. And again, I think that's what Tenna is ultimately meant to represent. But with La Niña and El Niño, isn't it just really coincidental that the chapter where we know for a fact Kris created the Dark Fountain is supposed to be kind of a nostalgia run of old memory, features a couple arguing and breaking up? Yeah. And then, of course, in Chapter 3, you have Ram. The Chapter 3 weird route might be my favorite thing in the whole game. Also, if these games that Ram is making for Kris to play in the Chapter 3 weird route are supposed to be a reflection of Kris's mental state, it's pretty violent. And also, they kill their friends. So, yeah. I think Ram kind of enforces that we should not look back upon nostalgic childhood memories as a way to try and repress the trauma that we've experienced more recently than those good memories. All Ram wants to do is to create a game and everything that Kris wants to enjoy and make it just the way that it used to be. But ultimately, that can't really happen, and for good reasons. Also, I'd feel remiss if I didn't mention Jevil, my baby boy. Toby Fox, please find a way to bring Jevil back. Again, I think if Kris did make the chapter 1 Dark World, I think Jevil is again supposed to be kind of a reflection of their mental state and how perhaps the best place to hide is insanity. That's the best way to escape your psychological trauma, is to convince yourself that you're actually the one doing fine and it's everyone else who's crazy. Now, I'ma keep it real with you. When I got to this section in the video, I was like, fuck, because I did not know how to explain this one. How do Undyne and Alphys fit into the themes of CA and your choices not mattering? I think maybe the reasons for Undyne proving my theory will become more apparent in a later video. I will say, you, the soul, actually try to tell Undyne about the Dark Fountains, and she doesn't give a fuck. That or she knows about it or just really thinks you're just making shit up. I'm not entirely sure. It's funny that the one time Kris goes to try and tell another adult and ask for help, this is how they react. Obviously, this is meant to be a joke, but I also kind of wonder if it's meant to show how Kris's choices really don't matter and there's no escape from the hell they find themselves in. What about Alphys? Toriel seems to kind of have a weird connection with Kris in general and seems to be kind of neglectful and just apathetic to some of the weird quirks and traits that Kris has. As we find out, Alphys actually talks to Toriel about Susie and her behavior at school. Does she not talk to Toriel about the weird things going on with Kris? Is Kris just mostly normal at school? I'm not entirely sure. Alphys does seem to genuinely care about Kris, and I'm actually excited to see more of Alphys in later chapters. I like how she's been utilized in this game. You know how there's this little side plot in the game with Alphys and Undyne where you can give Undyne some chocolates from Alphys or you can eat them? Well, there's actually something very interesting hidden in the depths of this game. But before I talk about that really quickly, I know some people are going to be commenting, wait, you didn't talk about the Dirty Brothers saying to Papyrus. First of all, Papyrus isn't in this fucking game. He's not in the code of the game. His name is literally never said once in the entirety of the game. Are we sure he even exists in Deltarune? Only time will tell. And also the convenience store owner dude, I don't think he's going to be that important in this game. I don't think he's a really important character, so we don't need to talk about him, right? Anyways, like I was saying, Deltarune saves every single choice and decision that you make. The game remembers if you don't give the chocolates to Undyne, if you eat some of them, if you just don't even talk to Alphys at all. In fact, the game remembers the specific decisions you make to use the thrash machine. The game remembers a very specific decision where you can tell Noelle that Susie likes chalk in chapter 1, and then Noelle will give Susie a gift of chalk at the beginning of the second chapter. This is an interaction a lot of people haven't seen. There's a lot of things like this in Deltarune, and that's because Deltarune remembers every single thing you do. It's just not telling you. In the actual code of the game, there are a lot of hidden checks and details for if the player did something or didn't do something. Undertale was a lot more in your face about these things. Also, Undertale was a finished game when it first came out. But Deltarune releasing in parts, I think, is so effective to its messaging about childhood trauma because you don't exactly get to process everything all at once. It's gonna take us a long time to see exactly what Toby Fox has been planning for us. But Deltarune remembers literally everything. Toby Fox said that he had one singular ending envisioned for Deltarune, and I believe him in the sense that I think the final cutscene of Deltarune, the literal last like 5 or 10 seconds we see, is going to be the same regardless of what choices you made up to that point. There's only so much we can change. While some things are an inevitability, and hell, even the end result of your journey sometimes feels like a foregone conclusion, the details of it aren't necessarily. And I think Deltarune is actually going to end with the positive messaging of that our choices do matter. But like Wiztale says at the beginning of the game, the more violent we are, the less love we might receive. And hey, that should be true for anyone who's an abuser. The more violent you are, the less love you should receive. I think Deltarune's gonna remember all the choices we made because it's going to ultimately show the characters in the game, Kris, everyone, who we are. Not Kris, not who Kris is, but who we, the player, are. I think there's a reason that chapter 1 of Deltarune ends with the normal version of the song Don't Forget, and then chapter 2 and 3 end with kind of a more distorted version. Chapter 4 seems like a very dark ending for Kris, Susie, and Wiztale, and it seems like it's becoming harder to remember the promise in our hearts. And with chapter 2 and 3, as the story gets darker yet darker, the message of the song starts to fade and becomes harder to decipher. But if you listen closely in your heart, you can still hear it, right?
There's a light inside your soul that's still shining in the cold with the truth, the promise in our hearts. Don't forget, I'm with you in the dark.
Well, this video wasn't supposed to be this long. Or take this long. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and tell me how you kind of feel about like the lighting, by the way, because sometimes I'm like, do I get a little too experimental with it? I tried to do like the pink and the gold lighting because, you know, Deltarune, it didn't really work well. I genuinely want to know your comments and see if you believe or support this theory, because I'm very curious to see just how right I will be in the coming years. I've been Big Citrus, and have a damn good one.